Good afternoon, everyone, and I hope you are able to hear me well. This is Benicio Frey. I'm an associate professor, Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neuroscience at McMaster University. And it's really a pleasure for me to do this webinar called Sleep as Circadian Rhythms in Mood Disorders from Research to Clinical Practice. I really wanted to mention that this activity is sponsored by CanBind and the Ontario Brain Institute. For those who are not familiar with CanBind, we are perhaps the largest study ever conducted in Canada regarding the identification of new biological markers or biomarkers for major depression. And if you want to hear a little bit more about or know a little bit more about our study, I've put the web page down here, www.canbind.ca, where you're going to find a lot of information about our studies and what we've been up to as far as the studies in the biomarkers for depression. So today I will talk for approximately about 40 minutes or so, and then we will have a lot of time to interact with the attendees. So if you look at your bar, you can see that there's a questions tab, and then at the end of the talk, everyone is welcome to type up your questions, and I will be very happy to answer the questions at the end of the presentation. So why don't we then get started? So just as a quick recap, our learning objectives to review how sleep and circadian rhythms are associated with mood, practical tools to monitor sleep and rhythms, we're going to talk about them, and learn about some therapeutic tips to promote sleep and daily rhythms. So like I said, the circadian system is associated with sleep-wake cycle, the food intake, the hormonal secretion, our temperature control, and even the immune system. This list is actually longer than this. This is just examples. The suprachiasmatic nuclei right here is our intrinsic biological clock. Each neuron has a 24-hour oscillation, and it's tightly regulated by our genes, by positive and negative feedback loops. And these cells that are present in our brain sends the message to the rest of our body through hormones, and also is regulated by our environment. So like I was saying, it's estimated that 10% of the peripheral genes in our body are under circadian regulation. So this is a study that is very interesting, that what they did is that they took for instance, cells from many parts of the body of mice, so the suprachiasmatic nuclei, ovaries, kidney, oviduct, the pituitary, and the uterus, and they place those cells on a dish, and they recorded the rhythms of those cells throughout a whole week. And as you can see, the cells kept firing on a circadian rhythm even when they were outside of the connection with the rest of the body. Of course, after some time, these cells, they lose the circadian control, but you can see that the circadian firing is kept even, many days after the cells are taken out of the rest of the body. So that's something that's very interesting. So I was telling about the Zeitgebers or synchronizers, so things about the environment that actually regulates our circadian system. So the dark light cycle is obviously the most potent synchronizer of our body. So you know, some people are sensitive to changes in the seasonality. So when, you know, when winter comes, like now we're starting in North, you know, on the northern hemisphere, we have the winter with shorter days and longer nights, and a lot of people are affected by the changes in the dark and light cycle. But the food intake, for instance, the time that we have our first bite in the morning is actually helpful to regulate our circadian rhythm. So, for instance, when we travel abroad, we travel to other time zones. One of the things that help us synchronizing with the new time is actually trying to have our meals at the same time that, you know, people are having the meals in that current time zone. Locomotor activity is very important. So the, you know, people who do exercise regularly, it's a very good synchronizer of our rhythms. Social interaction. So the first time, there are studies showing that the first time that we see a person at work, where we have the first social interaction, is actually one of the things that help regulating our daily rhythms, temperature control, the season, and so on. So now that we talked a little bit about the introduction, let's talk about how sleep is associated with mood and associated with cognition or brain function. So what would be the mechanisms? So there are some pretty, you know, fantastic studies that were published a few years back, and this is one of them. So this is the first study that actually showed the neuronal dendrites growing in vivo in mice learning a new task. So they were showing that the synapses, so the communication between one neuronal cell with the other, are actually formed during sleep. So what they did is that they trained the mice in this rod system here. So they were running on the spinning rod, and then during sleep, the same cells that were activating during this training were reactivated during sleep, particularly during the times of the slow wave oscillations, or so-called the deeper sleep. And then they showed, you know, visually the dendrites of those neuronal cells growing, and that was necessary for the mice to learn the task. So if they block this synaptic change here, the mice would not learn the new task. So this is pretty amazing, showing how the sleep is so important for our memory formation, and they are showing here some of the mechanism behind it. So what about humans? So about 10 days ago now, in the Nature Neuroscience, there was this study that was published. So essentially, they studied 28 volunteers that were randomized to either have a total sleep deprivation or have a normal sleep. So what they did is that they sleep deprive these people during nighttime, and then they did a functional MRI. So they took pictures of the brain when the brain was active, and then they were showing a series of picture slides. And then after 2 days, these volunteers came back to the lab and were asked to recognize those pictures. So this was a test for memory encoding while they were sleep deprived versus normal sleep. And what they found was that people that were sleep deprived, they had the worst memory performance, and the worst memory performance was associated with less activation in the hippocampus, which is an area that we know is one of the areas associated with memory. So if you want to look at the picture here, you can see that in white here you have people that had the normal sleep, so the hippocampus is being activated during memory encoding, so really nicely. And then SD here would be sleep deprived folks, and so when they were sleep deprived, the hippocampus was clearly less active compared to normal sleep. So if this is a 1 day of sleep deprivation, think about someone with chronic insomnia. and how much that chronic insomnia can impact memory performance over time. But what about emotional regulation? So the same group published another study using the same design. So volunteers were randomized to sleep deprivation or normal sleep, but instead of a memory task, they presented negative and neutral scenes, so emotionally negative scenes compared to emotionally neutral scenes. And they found that when these people were sleep deprived, the amygdala, which is another brain area that is highly associated with emotional regulation, was actually hyperactive, and there was a decrease in the engagement between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. And that's, again, you can see here very clearly. Here in white is normal sleep, and in black, when people were sleep deprived, the amygdala here being super overreactive. And what is interesting about this study is that now there are several studies, fMRI studies done in mood disorders, showing that individuals with depression, individuals with bipolar disorders, or individuals with mood disorders, one of the brain changes that happen is this increased amygdala activation and decreased connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. So sleep deprivation essentially causes brain changes that are very similar to the changes that we see in people that face problems with mood. So another way, another mechanism that our circadian rhythms can be regulated is, like I said, through genes. So these are just, this is an excellent review that I would recommend for those who want to know a little bit more about the genes and circadian rhythms. This review was done in bipolar disorder, showing here you can see how many studies associated, the circadian clock genes as a risk factors for the development of bipolar disorder. So here's the nucleus of the cell, and here's the cytoplasm. Remember, I said that the biological clock is genetically regulated. So these are the actual genes that regulate the machinery by positive and negative feedback loops. So polymorphism in certain genes like BMAL, like clock gene and PER gene, are associated with high risk, have been associated with high risk for development of bipolar disorder. And what is also interesting is that there are a number of studies showing that, for instance, lithium, which is a mood stabilizer, can in fact, regulate the gene expression of circadian rhythm genes. So there's a lot of talk these days about perhaps one of the areas, one of the mechanisms how lithium can help mood regulation might be through the regulation of circadian rhythm genes. So to finalize the mechanism part, I would recommend, this very nice commentary review by McClung, where McClung describes and discusses the circadian misalignment model of mood disorders, whereby changes in the suprachiasmatic nuclei and the changes that happens, serotonin, norepinephrine, noradrenaline, as associated with the sleep and circadian rhythm problems, can affect people's mood. And then that's associated with changes in the immune response, changes in the hypothalamic pituitary axis. So this is the stress response axis. So cortisol changes have been associated with depression and bipolar disorder, and also the metabolic issues that some people can have. And then it's perhaps not surprising that it's known that people with mood disorders, they are actually more sensitive to shift work, to jet lag, to changes in light and sleep patterns, like what happens, when the winter comes, or when the summer comes, and also, of course, stress. All right, so the next topic will be how sleep, circadian rhythms, and mood have been some of the results, in fact, from clinical studies showing changes in sleep, circadian rhythms, and mood disorders. So this is perhaps one of the most important, I think, slides I have today, because, you know, at the end of the day, in medicine, not just psychiatry, but in medicine in general, we want to be able eventually to prevent episodes from happening, right? So for us to be able to prevent episodes, we need to understand what happens before the episodes start. So what you're seeing in this cartoon is, you know, a number of studies that looked at symptoms that occurred before individuals, for instance, with bipolar disorder had a depressive episode or a manic episode. And as you can see here, as far as depression, psychomotor activity, which is also part of our rhythms, and a sleep disturbance are one of the top, very top symptoms that occur before the mood episodes occur. And in mania, in fact, the sleep disturbance is the very top one. So, you know, it's very critical to continue to assess sleep and rhythms even when people with mood disorders are doing well, because changes in circadian rhythms can occur prior to the mood episode. So these disturbances are considered what is called signal events that occur before the onset of the symptoms. This is another study published a little while back, but it's a very large study. You can see the sample sizes are very large. So what they did is that this is from the STEP BD study, which is one of the largest naturalistic studies ever conducted in bipolar disorder. And we know in the literature that when individuals are doing, over the lifetime of individuals with bipolar disorder, they spend half of their time feeling well. So here it says euthymic. So euthymic means clinical remission, so very minimal or no symptoms. And they spend about 25% of their lives depressed, and then about 10% of their lives with elevated mood, and another 10% overall with subsyndromal depression. But if this is in normal sleepers. If we look at short sleepers, you can see that the time that they spend feeling well is down from 50 to only 20%. And if we go to the other way, to the long sleepers, people that are sleeping too much, the time that they spend well decreases from 50 to 30%. So really, either sleeping too much or sleeping less are both associated with less time feeling well and more time feeling either depressed or with their mood elevated. So it's just another example how important it is to address sleep and rhythms in mood disorders. So that's a good segue to a study that we conducted, part of the Kanban. So this is Olivia Lega, one of my recent master's students that graduates here from McMaster. So the study was about objective and subjective measures of sleep and biological rhythms in depression and bipolar disorder. So this is still unpublished data. We are still finishing up the analysis. So today I'm going to present some of the preliminary results. So what we did is that individuals with depression, so 39 individuals with depression, 34 individuals with bipolar disorder, and 40 matched healthy volunteers that didn't have a history of mood disorders, for a total of 113 subjects. They came to our lab on visit 1, and then they did the diagnosis using this standardized questionnaire, and we put on their wrist, non-dominant wrist, this actigraph here that you're seeing here. So this actigraph is like a wrist band that collects information about their general activity, and collects information about their sleep pattern, collects information about the light exposure. As you can see, this dot here is where the light comes in. And we also measure in the urine this metabolite called 6-sulfathoxy-melatonin. So the melatonin that we secrete overnight is metabolized into this 6-sulfathoxy-melatonin, and this metabolite is concentrated in the urine. So if we collect a sample of urine first thing in the morning, we can have like an indirect index of nocturnal melatonin secretion. And then they did they used this actigraph for 15 days, and then they came back to the lab when we did a number of clinical questionnaires, including the Brian, which is the biological rhythm instrument. I'm going to talk about the Brian a little bit more later. The Pittsburgh sleep questionnaire, and some of other mood and functional and also quality of life questionnaires. So for the sake of this presentation, I'm going to present more of obviously the sleep and the circadian rhythm results. So when we looked at the levels of activity, you can break the levels of activity down into, rest, which is pretty much a sleep or zero activity. Then S2, so the first third of activity. S3, the second third, and then the S4, which is the highest level of activity. And then when we compare individuals with bipolar disorder, depression, and controls, we found that both individuals with bipolar disorder and depression had lower levels of activity compared to the healthy control group in the S2. So in this first level of activity, and you have the numbers over here. And in the second level here in the S3, there was a trend towards also lower activity in bipolars and unipolars. There were no group differences in terms of the activity at rest, and no group differences at the highest level of activity, which suggests that individuals with mood disorders, when they can reach a fair amount of high level of activity, they're doing well. They're not really different than individuals with no mood disorders. But here in the intermediate levels of activity is where the individuals with a mood disorder have significantly less. And then we did another type of statistical analysis using the actigraph, when we calculate what is called transitional probabilities. So this is the probability of one to move from rest to activity, or the probability of one to move from activity to rest. And we did that for daytime, and we did that for nighttime. So in our results, both bipolar disorder and the severity of depression, so MADRS is the scale of depressive severity, both of them were independent predictors of nighttime probability of going from activity to rest. And the severity of depression was an independent predictor of nighttime probability from going from rest to activity. So there were no differences in daytime transitional probabilities. So what this result suggests is that the severity of depression was associated with probably poorer, more activity at nighttime when these people were supposed to be sleeping. And sure enough, when we looked at the sleep parameters with actigraphy, we did find that the bipolar disorder had significantly more number of awakenings than unipolar depression and healthy controls. And when we look at the wake after sleep onset in minutes, so how many minutes these people spent awake at night when they were supposed to be sleeping. So both the depression and bipolar and unipolar bipolar disorder and unipolar depression, they had spent more time awake while they were supposed to be actually sleeping. So the interpretation of our results is that in a sample of mostly euthymic, so most of these people were not in a current episode, some of them were just mildly depressed, individuals with mood disorders, change in the activation levels seem to be more prominent at the lower and intermediate state of activity. People that reach the high state of activity weren't different than controls. And then, of course, by major depression and bipolar disorder were both associated with more disrupted sleep. So our results are very much consistent with the previous studies doing the actigraphy, that objective measure using the wrist device. So what I'm showing here is a meta-analysis of all of the studies that were published up until 2015 in individuals with bipolar disorder in remission. And you can see the results here. If you look at sleep latency, so how much time it takes for one to get to sleep. So for individuals with bipolar disorder, they were significantly longer than controls. So when the diamond is not crossing the zero, means that the difference between the bipolar subjects and the controls, or controls means individuals with no mood disorders, is significantly different. So essentially, individuals with bipolar disorder, it took longer, much longer for them to get to sleep. The sleep duration was actually longer, so they were sleeping, in fact, too much. But still, they had broken sleep because the wake after sleep onset in minutes was higher, so they spent more time awake when they're supposed to be sleeping. And then the sleep efficiency was actually lower in the bipolar group, higher in the control. So their sleep was less efficient as a result compared to control. So remember that these studies, all of these studies here that are listed here, were done in individuals with bipolar disorder when they were doing clinically well. They were euthymic, they were not on a major episode, and even not outside the episode, objective sleep changes were detected. So to wrap up the clinical study section of this talk, I'm going to just mention this study that we conducted a couple of years ago now, where we looked at the biological rhythms, if biological rhythms were associated with worse postpartum mood. So this is a longitudinal study where 18 pregnant women, 38 were considered high risk for a postpartum episode, which means that they had a previous diagnosis of depression or a previous diagnosis of bipolar disorder. And we compared them with 45 pregnant women with no history of mood disorders. So we followed them. All of these women were doing fine during pregnancy. They were not on an episode. They're all doing well. And we saw them first in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. And then we saw them again between 6 and 12 weeks postpartum. Why 6 and 12 weeks? Because this is the period of highest risk for postpartum depression to happen. So Elizabeth is another previous master's student of mine. And then we did a number of clinical questionnaires, including this depression severity, the biological rhythms, the Bryan and the Pittsburgh sleep. And what we found was that even though both the biological rhythm questionnaire and the sleep questionnaire were associated with postpartum mood worsening, when you put both of these variables together in a linear regression model, in fact, the biological rhythms is the only one that remained positive. So the prediction of changes in the biological rhythms is stronger than the changes in the sleep quality as far as worse postpartum mood. And this was true for both the healthy control population and then the mood group over here. And then a sample of these women, 33 of them had the actigraph, so we could also capture some objective sleep and objective circadian rhythm parameters. And when we put the significant parameters together in the linear regression model, both, again, the subjective biological rhythm questionnaire and the sleep efficiency, the changes in sleep efficiency from the actigraph, they were the ones that were independent predictors of worse changes in mood postpartum. So both a subjective biological rhythm and an objective sleep parameter were associated with worse mood postpartum. So that wraps up some of the clinical studies on sleep and rhythms in mood disorders. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about how can we correctly diagnose sleep and circadian rhythm disorders. Well, the first thing is a good clinical history. So nothing is really better than a good clinical history. So when you know, we go to the doctor, we want our doctor to ask us questions about our sleep profile. So if we are healthcare professionals, these are the questions that we want to ask. If we are patients, these are the questions that we want our, you know, professionals to ask. So sleep profile is very important. So we want to ask about the difficulties in initiating or maintaining sleep, early awakenings, the sleep, subjective sleep quality. We want to ask about the onset and the course of the sleep disturbances. When did that start? And is there any, is your insomnia getting better or getting worse? We also want to know what are the consequences or the impact of the sleep disturbance in people's life in terms of his or her work or school tasks or relationships, etc. We want to ask about previous treatments. Have you been treated before? How have you responded to treatment? And we also want to know, very important, we want to know about precipitating factors. What are the triggers that can worsen your sleep? So really, those are some of the things we want to make sure we ask. We also want to make sure we ask both the diurnal and nocturnal daily habits or the person's routine, because routine is very important, obviously, to as a treatment tool to correct or regulate any abnormalities in daily rhythms. So we want to ask people the time that they normally go to bed, the time that they normally wake up. We want to ask about day napping, whether that's voluntary or not. So some people will find that they nap because they want to, because they like to, but other people say that they nap because they have to, they just cannot stay awake. So we want to ask those questions. We want to ask about the physical exercise routine. We want to ask about their general activity. We want to ask about any use of alcohol, stimulants like caffeine or others, because substances that depress our brain, like the alcohol, or substances that stimulate our brain, can affect sleep or daily rhythms. We also want to ask about the bedtime routine. So what about the bedroom? What about blinders? What about, you know, there's a patient, I'll never forget, there's a patient that, you know, most of her sleep problems were solved, believe it or not, by my recommendation of her putting blinders in her bedroom. So, you know, things that might sound, you know, obvious may not be obvious for some people. And then finally, we also want to know and ask about symptoms that are associated with sleep disturbances or insomnia. So do you have problems with concentration? Do you have problems paying attention? Or what about your memory? We saw how much sleep is associated with the memory consolidation. We want to ask about mood, irritability, lack of patience, somnolence, fatigue, particularly daytime fatigue, lack of energy. Like, these are very common symptoms of people with insomnia and sleep problems. We want to ask about their mental conditions or any physical conditions that can be associated with sleep disturbance. One of the obvious ones is obviously, you know, mood disorders, but also anxiety, sleep apnea, obesity, and etc. So in terms of diagnosis, there are some useful tools nowadays that we can use with ourselves or with patients, if any of the attendees are healthcare professionals. So a very simple one that is very, very, very powerful is a sleep diary. So here is the reference of this sleep diary. This is actually a sleep diary promoted by a consensus of a large number of sleep specialists. They came up with this sleep diary suggestions. So essentially, this is the day. This is 7 days. So you ask your patients, or if you want to know about your own sleep, you can do yourself. So put the today's date here, and then you record once a day. What time did you get into bed? What time did you try to go to sleep? How long did it take you to fall asleep? How many times did you wake up? In total, how long did this awakenings last? What time was your final awakening? What time did you actually get out of bed? And how would you rate the quality of your sleep? And there's space here for some comments for certain things that might affect, like I have too many, I drank too much that day, or, whatever, I drank too much coffee. So with that, if you do that for 7 days, you can see that there's a lot you're going to learn about your patterns of sleep issues, and then you can identify which are the domains that might be particularly affected, so that you can use that as a therapeutic tool to fix the sleep problem. And then I mentioned I was going to talk a little bit about the Bryan questionnaire. So the biological rhythm questionnaire was developed back in 2009, and this is what some of the questions look like. So there are several domains. So the sleep domain, one of the questions is, do you have problems falling asleep at the usual time? If yes, how frequently? So no, not at all. I haven't had any problems falling asleep in this past couple of weeks. Or sometimes I have, or very rarely I have, or often have. So the higher the scores in this questionnaire, the worse the circadian rhythms. So there are 4 main domains of this questionnaire. So there's a sleep domain that I showed, but there's also a social subdomain, there's the general activity subdomain, and then there's the eating behavioral subdomain. And at the very end, there are a few questions that ask about chronotype. So if that person is more of a morning person or more of an evening person, but this chronotype does not enter in the total scores. And for the sake of time here, I'm just listing some of the studies, and we did most of this, we participated in most of this. But you can see that using this self-reported biological rhythm questionnaire, the Bryan, it's been associated with worsening in postpartum mood. I showed you those 2 studies, but it's been also associated with severity of depression, both in bipolar disorder and major depressive disorder. It's been associated with more oxidative stress in our bloodstream. This is a study for one of my past master students. Worse biological rhythms have been associated with poor psychosocial functioning. So there are a couple of studies, independent studies showing that, and also worse quality of life. So Olivia Allega, and this is a study that was part of the Canbine. Dr. Kennedy here is the PI of Canbine, and this paper has just been published 2018. So what we did is that we tried to validate this questionnaire against objective measures of sleep and rhythms. So what we found in this study is that the scores of the biological rhythms questionnaire was correlated with more time of people staying awake when they were supposed to be sleeping, so wake after sleep onset, was correlated with nighttime activity. And what you can see here in this cartoon is that was the worse the scores, the higher the worse the scores, the lower the nocturnal melatonin secretion here that we collected with the urine sample. So that suggests that this biological rhythm subjective questionnaire were correlated somewhat with some objective measures of sleep and daily rhythms. Another tool that people are using these days, there's a lot of discussion about how the Fitbit might, and other, the iWatch and other watches that, the Garmin watch, that can track activity and sleep, measures how much they're sensitive. This is the one from Philips that we use in our research. So this is the output that you get from this device. So you can see that the blue is the time that the person is sleeping, and then the green is the time that the person is in bed but not sleeping, so just at rest. Yellow, you can see that there's the light exposure, so the closer to the bedtime, the less light exposure, and so on. So this, for those who have access to this type of tool, it's really, really powerful. I've used with some of my patients, and it's really, really helpful. And then if you think you might have, sleep apnea or some sort of a sleep disorder, or if you think that your patient may have, you can request your family doctor, you can send your patient to a sleep study. So the polysomnography can be really helpful in terms of depicting, more intrinsic sleep disorders. And then I believe this is the last or the second last slide in terms of treatment options. So these are some of the various treatment options that are available for sleep and circadian rhythm disorders. So the first one is obviously sleep hygiene. So this is the very first thing that we have to talk to our patients if they have any sleep disturbance, in terms of you just want to stay in bed while you are sleeping. If you have trouble falling asleep for more than, say, 20-30 minutes, you shouldn't stay in bed and be ruminating in bed for too long. You should get out of the bed and come back when you're tired. If you have sleep problems, you should avoid napping during the day, of course, because if you nap during the day, then you might decrease your sleep drive and then have more trouble falling asleep. If you don't have a sleep problem, then napping is fine. Daytime napping is only a problem for those who have a sleep problem, of course. And then you want to avoid the stimulants, particularly late in the afternoon, close to bedtime, and so on. There is also a new type of cognitive behavioral therapy called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. There's actually many randomized controlled trials these days that are positive. This is actually a very powerful, very, very effective tool to improve sleep disturbance. It's been tested in individuals with mood disorders as well, and it's really, really good. So it's usually short, only 4 to 6 sessions, and it's really, really a powerful treatment tool. Sleep restriction is part of the cognitive behavioral component of CBTI, which means that you want to either only stay in bed while you are sleeping. So if you're not sleeping, you should get out of bed, or you might also want to restrict the person to wake up earlier than usual to build that sleep drive in the beginning to reset the brain. So this is one of the tips, one of the tools. There's another type of therapy called interpersonal and social rhythm therapy that has been tested for mood disorders, and it was positive. There is a newer type of therapy called behavioral activation, which has been tested and approved for depression, is in the Canadian guidelines for depression. It's very powerful. We know that if we activate our body, the depression scores, the depression symptoms usually go down. I'm sure all of you have heard of the light therapy, particularly for seasonal affective disorder. But last year or the year before, Dr. Ray Lamb from University of British Columbia, also a co-investigator in Combine, published a randomized trial showing that the light therapy might be helpful for even non-seasonal depression. So it's one of the tools. Then the Norwegian group published earlier this year a randomized trial using the blue blocking glasses for individuals with acute mania, and in fact it did decrease the scores compared to non-blue blocking glasses. So it's a really, really interesting study. So this is an area that we're still learning from it. And then of course, if we do everything that we can do and still we don't have a proper sleep, some medications can be helpful, for instance melatonin, or the use of sleep aids, etc. And with that, I'll finish off with this slide about future directions. So I believe the future direction is associated with the big data. This is a really interesting article published earlier this year that says developing early warning signs that have the potential to be used in automated monitoring is one of the most exciting future directions in contemporary research. So what they are saying here is that, remember, going back to the early signs, so what we want to know is that can we use a device, whether it's a Fitbit or another wrist device, or even there are apps these days that track our activity, that track our sleep. Can we use can those devices signal before and send us a text or a message before the depression starts or before the mania starts, so we can do something about it. So this is the whole new area of research, and it's really exciting days that we're going to know a lot more about in the next 5-10 years. So with that, I would like to thank all of you for your attention in this webinar. We don't do research alone, so I have a long list of important collaborators in this circadian rhythm studies with Cambine. Again, I would like to thank our sponsor, Cambine, and the Ontario Brain Institute. Just a reminder for those of you who want to know more about the biomarker studies in depression, here's the link of the website. And now it's 3:50, so we have about 10 minutes or so that we can discuss and answer questions. So let me see, I'm going to the question pad, so if you have any questions, please feel free to type them up. I don't see any questions right now, but feel free to type up your questions and I will read them aloud, and then I'll try to answer them as best as I can. So there's a tab saying called questions. You can type up the questions there. Okay, so there's one question here. So how small a shift in sleep disturbance would you treat with a sleep aid if someone has a history of bipolar disorder? So this is an excellent question. So I don't think there is a specific threshold of shift, how many hours or how many minutes. But remember when I talked about the history? So the history will tell me what are the consequences of that sleep disturbance in the life of that person. If the sleep disturbance, regardless if it's 30 minutes or 45 minutes or an hour, it doesn't matter. But if we identify, me and my patient, that sleep disturbance is associated with a negative impact in his or her life, I think that's enough for an intervention. Intervention doesn't mean necessarily medication. So intervention means, first off, sleep hygiene, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, and so on, all of those measures. And if none of them work, then yes, I will definitely recommend a sleep medication, because we know that long-term sleep problems can increase the risk for both depression or manic episode. So that will be like the way I would go with my patients. So it's about the impact of the sleep disturbance in his or her life. So there's another question here. What is the optimal sleeping time? How many hours for people with and without mood disorders? Thank you for the question. Yeah, we know that there is actually, I don't have the slide here with me, but there's actually a really, really large study, like thousands of people. And if we look at the sleep time in our population, it actually follows a really nice, parametric curve. So most people sleep between 7 to 9 hours. So, for a lot of people, 7.5 to 8 would be like the average, but that's the average for the general population, right? So we're going to find that within that, there's people that do well with 7 hours, there's people that do well with 6 hours and a half, and there are people that they need 9 hours to be able to function. So again, it is about, you know, we have a different, perhaps, you know, circadian genes, and we have a different, you know, systems. So there isn't one time fits all bills, but overall, most people would need between 7 and 9 hours of sleep, of total sleep per day to be able to function optimally. Keeping in mind that there could be, you know, extreme cases. And that's not really different between people with or without a mood disorder. So it's not really, there isn't really literature suggesting that, oh, people with mood disorders, they necessarily need, for instance, more, because there are plenty of literature showing that more sleep can be associated with actually poorer, you know, mood. So there really, people with or without mood disorders will need somewhere between 7 and 9 hours, and it's a lot of it is individualized. So how much sleep do you need to function well? How much sleep do you need so your brain, you know, you have good concentration, good attention? How much sleep do you need so your mood is not affected, essentially? Very good questions. We have time for more. We have 3 more minutes. Don't be shy. Any other questions? Anything else anybody would like to ask? Maybe somebody's typing up. Okay, folks. So if there isn't, oh, here it is. Very good. So there's another one. Subjectively speaking, is there data to support that with age, sleeping patterns change or decrease? For instance, my grandparents can now sleep 5 to 6 hours now, as opposed to 8, 9, 1 or 2 decades ago. Absolutely. You're absolutely right. There are plenty of studies showing sleep pattern changes as we get older. And elderly people, they generally need significantly less sleep than, let's say, midlife adults or young adults. So definitely, you know, children sleep more, even adolescents, they sleep more. And then adults up to middle age, they sleep, like I said, 7 to 9 hours, you know, average 7.5 or 8. And then as people progress beyond 50, 60 years old, It's not uncommon to see people sleeping well with 5 to 6 hours. This is part of the brain aging process, and it's you're absolutely right. There's plenty data to support that. Very nice. So it's 4 o'clock. I would like to thank all of you for your attention, and thanks for being engaged at the end and sending questions. I hope you enjoyed this webinar, and for anyone who would like to follow up with me, I'll be happy to by email. Please feel free to follow up after the webinar and discuss anything else that you might want. Thank you very much, and once again, thanks Cambine, thanks OBI, thanks Adam and Sagar, Dr. Sagar Parikh, for their help organizing this webinar. I'll see you next time. Take care. Sleep well. Bye.